You know, it's true what they say, less really is more. Sooner or later, the day comes to us all when we're asked to write a paper that just feels too long to be possible, whether that's 10 pages, 20 pages, or if you're having a really bad day, even more. It doesn't really matter how long the paper is. What matters is that it feels intimidating. You might find yourself asking, how could I possibly write a paper this long? Quite a while ago, we talked about a crucial strategy for making your papers longer. It was the simple trick of showing your work and explaining your thoughts carefully and thoroughly. If you find yourself coming up short, that's the first thing to check. Lately, though, I've noticed another strategy that writers who are learning to write longer papers often use, and it's a strategy that makes sense. If you need to write a longer paper, just write about more things. But that's not actually an effective strategy, and while it will probably get you a longer paper, it will also probably get you a worse one. So today, I'll show you why writing about more things is not an effective strategy, and I'll show you why writing about less can actually help you to write longer and better papers. So, as I was saying, when it comes to writing longer papers, many writers will panic. They think about times that they struggled to write a 4-page paper, so how are they going to manage 10? Well, it's a fair question, and it's a reasonable strategy in a panic-motivated state just to try to heap as much stuff into your paper as possible. Come what may, you'll fill those 10 pages with anything and everything you scrape off the internet floor. Take, for example, a student who's writing about the negative effects of social media and the need to find alternate ways of using our time. When they find out that they need to write a longer paper than they originally thought, they do even more research and come up with lists and lists of things that people can do instead of scrolling and scrolling until they find something more interesting. With a strategy like that, we'll end up with a paper full of recommendations of other things to do with someone's time. Things like going for walks, playing sports, spending time with friends, reading, or taking up hobbies like painting, cooking, or rock climbing. This paper is long, and it's provided a multitude of alternative activities that people can do. But it's also pretty much just a list. It hasn't really explained any of its ideas in a very useful way. Because the writer has chosen to talk about so many different things in a desperate and misguided attempt to make their paper longer, they have filled their page count, but they've essentially filled it with nothing. They have so many different ideas to deal with that they haven't left themselves any room to talk about those ideas. So all they can really do is mention each one before zooming off to the next. And this gets us to the paradox of scope. The more you try to talk about in a paper, the less room you'll actually have to talk about it, and ultimately, the less you'll have to say. I've seen writers who are aiming for a 10-page paper manage to hit about 7 or so with this strategy, and then feel pretty discouraged that even with all of that work, they still haven't managed to hit their minimum page count. The reality, though, is that this approach will never be enough, and that's because the strategy of just looking for more and more to say is a strategy that won't actually help you to write a paper that is both longer and more interesting. In a counterintuitive sense, the more you try to talk about, the less you'll have to say. In order to understand how less is more when it comes to writing, let's imagine ourselves in the shoes of two different writers working on similar projects. Person A has taken on the task of writing a description of all of the professors at their university. And I don't mean each of them, I mean all of them collectively. Jackpot, you might say. With hundreds of professors to talk about, that introduction could go on for pages and pages. In fact, you might feel like you have almost limitless amounts of information to work with. But remember, anything we write in this project has to be a true description of all the professors on campus. So with that in mind, how much can we actually say? What is there to talk about? Well, it is true that all of the professors are employees of the university, and odds are pretty good that they're all human beings. But if we were writing this project, we'd probably have a hard time saying much more than that. The simple reality is that by expanding the scope of the project to be so broad, we've taken away our ability to say much that's worth saying. Sure, we could maybe try to find one fun fact about each professor, but we'd be so pressed for space and time that we'd only be able to mention these things in passing. We'd hit our page count before we knew it, without really saying anything that's worth saying. Now, in contrast, imagine somebody who has to write something of the same length, but chooses instead to focus their description on only a single professor. If you were in their shoes, you could select a professor, visit their office, and ask them some questions in order to get to know them. In that interview, you could learn where they went to school, how long they've worked at the university, and how many people are in their family. You could ask them what kind of music they listen to, what shows they like to watch, and what games they like to play. You could even find out their favorite color, their favorite ice cream flavor, or you could ask them to tell the story about that one time they single-handedly got class canceled when they were a student. And you could keep going and going. With a narrower scope, the number of things that you can talk about actually goes up. There's more that you can say about one professor than you could ever say about all of them collectively. And yeah, you could give each professor on campus the same in-depth treatment, but then you'd end up with something more like an 800-page paper, and that's not quite what we're after either. So the trick is to recognize that narrowing your scope will actually help you to write a longer paper. In the same way that you can say more things and more interesting things about a single professor, you can write a more interesting paper about a narrower topic. Really, academic writing is a grand exercise in the less is more approach. I can think of articles I've read that have spent pages and pages talking about the usage of semicolons in a single novel, that talk about a single aspect of one exhibit in one museum, or that go on for a half hour about the origins of the sh sound in English. In fact, I often hear academic writing described as a fundamental choice between breadth and depth. You can write a lot of shallow things on a broad topic, or you can choose a narrower topic that allows you to go deeper. And in almost every case, academic writing calls for depth rather than breadth. So if your task is to write a paper about reptiles, remember that a broad topic will actually work against you. What could you say about all reptiles collectively? That they have scales? That they're ectotherms? After you've said that, you might run out of things to say. Zero in on one specific species, though, and your narrower scope will open you up to a whole new depth of possibilities. You could write about that species' diet, habitat, and behaviors, and in addition to that, your paper will just be inherently more interesting. I mean, think about it. Would you rather read a generic overview of all reptiles collectively in 10 pages, or would you rather read an in-depth explanation of the life and times of the red-eared slider? Or going back to the social media example that we started with, you could aim for volume and just talk about 50 different things that someone could do instead of using social media. But again, in the end, that paper would be more of a list than an essay. Imagine what would happen, though, if instead of going broad, you narrowed your focus and developed an argument that readers should pick up gardening instead of using social media. With that narrower topic, you'd be in a great position to describe the dangers of overusing social media, explain the benefits of gardening, and then give your readers a lot of reasons to pick up gardening instead. So, rather than just having a brief mention of gardening in an overwhelming but essentially shallow sea of alternatives, you can develop a focused, effective, and persuasive argument. And yes, before we wrap up, it is true that you can talk about more things in a longer paper. If you're writing a 300-page dissertation, for example, you're going to need more material than if you're just writing a 10-page paper. But what I see all the time and what you should avoid is trying to cram 300 pages of content into a 10-page paper. Instead of thinking about the narrower, more interesting topic that fits the scale of a 10-page paper, writers tend to panic and throw everything they have at it. So while it is possible to make the scope of your project too narrow, it's much more common for writers to make it too broad in an effort to fill space. When that happens, they do fill the space, but it's mostly just with fluff. It's counterintuitive to think that you'll have more to say when you choose to write about less, but it's actually true. You'll be able to write longer and better papers when you narrow the scope of your project because it will enable you to write more deeply. The best papers that I can remember reading over the years have all been incredibly specific, and they've succeeded because their narrower focus has made it possible for them to get into the practical specifics of their topic and to offer unique insights and perspectives. In other words, writing broad limits you to writing about generalized ideas and concepts, while writing narrow makes it possible for you to get into the nuts and bolts of real life. And I don't know, but if our writing doesn't actually connect to real life, what's it good for? So start looking for ways to narrow the scope of your writing, ways to push for depth rather than breadth. I'll tell you what, it's one of the best kept secrets in writing, and there's plenty more where this one came from, so stay tuned and I'll see you soon.